Good afternoon. It's so good to see you this afternoon. This is our 1-year anniversary of Tell Me a Story. It's hard to believe it's been a whole year since we started this. And we have heard some good ones, haven't we? They've all been good in their own way. We've wanted to cry at some, and we've laughed at many of them, and have been touched and moved, and just so glad that those of you who have shared have done that. And there are a lot of you who have told your stories who are here today, and many of the others of you have stories that we will yet hear, I'm sure. I want to make one announcement before we begin. As most of you know who live in South Village especially, the power is going to be off in South Village for all day tomorrow, pretty much. And we're doing a lot of special events, but North Village people were not notified of this. Only South Village people were notified. We are doing 3 movies here in the auditorium tomorrow. So if South Village people especially need a place to just be, but North Village people are certainly invited too. We're doing March of the Penguins at 10 o'clock in the morning to chill everybody down. And then another one in the afternoon at 1, Medicine Man with Sean Connery, and there's beautiful scenery in that. It's a really good story. And then that beautiful movie Field of Dreams at 3 o'clock. It's a good baseball story if you like baseball. And I have some little flyers here. I'll put them on the piano if you want to take one of them just to remind you of those times. And people in South Village got a list of this, but North Village people did not. So if you'd like, North Village especially, if you'd like a copy of this. Okay, on with the show. Our first storyteller today is Ellen Bullen. And she and her husband Pierce moved to Springmore in July 2011. And they live in house number 16. And she's going to tell a story about her father today, a patriot like all, like all, I wrote that down right, a patriot like all the others. So come, Ellen.
I'm a little shorter than Phyllis. Is this right? My charismatic father was a bundle of contradictions. A loyal American citizen for 70 years. He was very much a Spaniard all of his 92 years. A very private person, he nevertheless loved telling about his adventures to family and friends, and this is one of them. When World War II started, my father was teaching Spanish language and literature at NYU, and he answered a call put out by the government. They needed broadcasters in the European languages for Radio Free Europe, and Spanish was his native language, and he said he would do so, and for some time he taught all day and broadcast in the wee hours of the morning. Then he was approached by the OWI, if any of you remember, the Office of War Information, and they asked him, even if he was over age, if he would join, and he said, of course. They sent him to North Africa, where he did prisoner of war exchange. He did intelligence work at various times, and he ran the free radio station in Morocco, in Rabat. Eventually, the ulcer he had as a university student caught up with him, and he was sent to the hospital in Iran. We people who are older remember that in those days nobody really knew what caused ulcers, and there wasn't much treatment. You just basically rested in the hospital until you were well enough to get out. The hospital, Army Hospital, was in Oran, Algeria. And at that point, the war in that corner of the world was going very badly. It was on the water, and every Allied ship that came into the port was blown up. And they could not find the leak. They knew that there was a leak, that there were spies. They could not find them. One day, my father, who had excellent long-distance vision, looked across the bay from his hospital room, and he saw a building with something sticking out of it. And in wartime, especially that war so immediate, anything unusual should be investigated. He knew he was close to getting out of the hospital, and he thought, when I get out, I'm going to go there and investigate it. And he was eventually sprung and went to his quarters. He did have civilian clothes with him, and he put on civilian clothes and went to the area and was surprised to find that it was an area, streets of abandoned warehouses. So he began walking up and down the streets, and was he surprised to hear typing coming from one of those abandoned warehouses. So he knocked on the door, and a man whom he immediately recognized as having a familiar face came to the door, and he was furious with my father. He shouted at him and shook his fist. My father, who was no dummy, realized that if the man killed him, they would never even find his body. So he pretended to be very humble and very confused. Oh, if you all had only known my father, he was a very dominant man, and he was neither humble nor confused, but he knew he had to be to save his life. The man eventually let him go with a few curses. My father went back to his quarters, and he sat down and tried to figure out, where have I seen that face before? And all of a sudden it came to him. In the officers' mess, the dining hall where the officers ate, there were huge books of photographs, and the officers were told, look at those photographs every single day until every face in them is as familiar to you as your own family's faces. And that was where he had seen that face before. But in the book, the photograph was of a young man with prematurely white hair, and now the man was older and had dyed his hair black. My father went to the authorities, and they investigated, and there was the nest of spies responsible for all those ships being sunk. I asked my father, and people have asked me, I said to Daddy, did you get a decoration? He said, of course not. I was just doing my duty like everybody else. And so I say he was a patriot like all the others.
I want you to do one more thing. I want you to tell us his name.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pedro Villa Fernandez. And some of you who studied Spanish may have studied with his books of textbooks with original short stories.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
He's so much daddy to me.
Yeah. Dorothy Rutledge is going to come next, and she has a beautiful story titled Before and After the Diagnosis of Dementia, which is about her husband. Dorothy lives in Villa 18 and has been here since a year and a half, January of 2012. Dorothy.
The day that my life changed completely was the day that my husband Fred was. Can you hear?
No.
What do I need to do?
Pull it out for a bit.
Yeah, let's do it a little closer. Don't let me get it. There we go. Try that.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Is this okay? The day that my life changed completely was the day that my husband Fred was diagnosed with dementia. I had noticed for several years that his personality was gradually changing, but I had just attributed this to his getting older. But now he was having trouble trying to do things that he had never had any trouble with, that it had always been very easy for him. He had been an engineer for Georgia Power Company, and he could do all sorts of things. He had fenced in an 80-acre farm, had built a nice barn for his cattle, and he could repair, it seemed. He could repair anything around the house that needed to be repaired. When our daughters were growing up, our two girls, they they seemed to think that their daddy could do anything, could fix anything, and could handle any problem. And I guess most of the time I thought that too. When Carol, our older daughter, was just a toddler, and I was reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears to them, little baby bear's chair was broken. And Carol then came up with, "Don't cry, baby bear. Daddy will fix it when he gets home." And from then on, when I read that story, I had to include that phrase. Fred also had been very well organized and had kept all of his records very neatly filed. I sometimes called him Mr. Efficiency. But now he was having trouble just balancing a checkbook. He had gotten lost several times while driving, and it seemed to me that he was losing his ability to think rationally. I had taken Fred to a doctor a couple of years before the diagnosis, but it was too early then for the doctor to determine whether this was the beginning of dementia, even though he realized that he was having some problems. It was extremely frustrating to me during these 2 years preceding the diagnosis, because it seemed to me that I was the only person who realized that something was wrong with Fred. And since Fred was so outgoing and was such a good, helpful neighbor to everyone, then anytime I mentioned to anyone, the few times I mentioned to anyone that I thought Fred was having problems, I was assured that Fred was fine. I began thinking that people seemed to think something was wrong with me for thinking something was wrong with Fred. But maybe I was just getting paranoid. It was finally in 1995, when Fred was 71 years old, I took him to the memory clinic at Duke. The neurologist and his team did a lot of examinations, some thorough examinations, including an MRI, psychological exams, and so on, over a period of a couple of weeks. On the day that we were to learn the diagnosis, I sat in a private waiting room, and Fred was in the examining room. The neurologist, along with another doctor, came in to talk to me. And he explained that they had finally decided that what Fred's problem was that it was a dysfunction of the frontal lobe, or frontal lobe dementia. I asked, "Isn't that the part of the brain that controls the emotions?" And the neurologist agreed. My mind was spinning then, and I was thinking that this explains why his personality is changing, not just a decline of mental abilities. I suddenly blurted out, "Well, this is sort of a relief. Nobody believed me when I said something was wrong with Fred, so now I know it's not just my imagination." As he began explaining that this is a very, very serious disease, my thoughts were continuing to spin. I began shaking my head, and I said, "No, this is not a relief. This is definitely not a relief at all." I was completely stunned, and I felt that I was in a daze. I believe I was expecting, or at least hoping, that the neurologist would tell me that Fred had some age-related problem that could be fixed either with medicine or surgery, and then I would have the satisfaction of knowing that I was correct in realizing something was wrong, and also that we could get back to normal, and Fred would be this nice, capable, intelligent man that he had always been. The doctor then began explaining to me some changes we would have to make, the main one being that Fred should not drive anymore. I agreed, since I knew that Fred was already having problems getting lost, and I was driving most of the time anyway. When Fred drove, I was the navigator. There was one request that I made of the doctor, and that was that I should be in the room with him, with Fred, when the doctor told him that he could no longer drive. I felt that I had to be there in case Fred needed to be assured that I would be there to do the driving for him. The doctor agreed with this. Then the doctor asked, "He doesn't use a chainsaw, does he?" And I had to answer, "He just bought a new one yesterday." That seemed ironic, but it was true. When I assured the doctor that he no longer went into the woods by himself to cut down trees, but just enjoyed cutting up firewood for our fireplace, the doctor said that Fred should be able to do that for a while yet, but I should watch him closely. After this diagnosis, I had to learn to accept the changes in Fred. I had known nothing about dementia, but I was determined to take good care of him and to make the best of an undesirable situation. Our daughter Barbara had come to live with us to help me with Fred, and of course he was delighted for that. Soon we began taking Fred to a daycare center in Cary 3 days a week, and he enjoyed the activities with the other men and women who attended. I joined a couple of support groups, and that helped me a lot. Fred was able to sing in the choir at church for a few more years before the dementia became severe. One of the men in the choir would look after Fred, would help him with his choir robe, and also make sure he stayed with the choir and did not get lost in the church. Eventually, we put Fred in the Veterans Nursing Home in Fayetteville, and they took very good care of him. He was there less than a year when he died in 2003. While Fred was in the nursing home, his dementia had progressed so much that he had lost touch with reality, or what was real to him was completely different from what is real to most of us. I decided then that he had his own reality and that there was no way that he could enter into my reality. He wasn't capable of it. So I would do my best to enter into his reality, or at least try to understand it. To give an example, at the nursing home I would push his wheelchair out on the porch and pull up a chair next to him, and we would talk. Once he wanted to tell me something that happened. He said, "There was a woman out in the street and she was cursing. She was cursing in the middle of the street. But she won't do that anymore. A policeman came and put her in jail, and they put her in the electric chair." I asked him, "Fred, can they put someone in the electric chair for cursing in the street?" And he said, "Yes, they can. People shouldn't be in the street cursing." I answered, "Well, I didn't know that." Fred might have thought that he had taught me quite a lot, because so often when he would innocently tell me something that I knew could not be true, I would say, "I didn't know that." I knew that if I argued with him or tried to correct him, he would become very upset, so I just accepted his reality. A few weeks after Fred died, it seemed that I was grieving for two different people. At times, I wanted so much to visit the nursing home and push Fred in his wheelchair to the porch and sit and talk to him. I was grieving for this man with dementia who had lost touch with reality. At other times, I would think about the intelligent, capable man who it seemed could handle any situation, and I wanted so much to have him back. I'm not sure that I believe that after a death there is such a thing as closure, but I have learned not to dwell on the past, but to enjoy and make the best of the present and to look forward to the future.
Dorothy, you took a real risk to share that with us this afternoon. Thank you. There are many caregivers in this room, and I think you're giving us an insight into your experience in caregiving. I think will be helpful to all of us. Thank you again for doing that, Dorothy. We want to shift gears now. Harold Barnt is going to come and speak with us about experiences he had in the U.S. Army. Harold and his wife Dolores, who's sitting behind him, have lived in house number 36 since November of 2011. And you're going to need this microphone higher, aren't you? So you come on. Harold, thank you.
I graduated from high school at the age of 17 in June of 1950. And a little bit later in that month, I was privileged to attend the Boy Scout Jamboree that was only a 15-minute drive from my home. It was located that year in Valley Forge in the suburbs of Philadelphia. While I was there, I remember seeing a newspaper headline that had the word Korea in it. And I don't know if I knew where Korea was, but eventually I found out because I spent a year and a half in Korea. What happened there in the latter part of June of 1950 was that the armed forces of North Korea came down across the 38th parallel, which had been established to separate North from South Korea at the end of the Second World War. Interestingly, that was 63 years ago today. Today, 63 years ago, is when the Korean War began. And it wasn't too much of a minor thing. I think we lost about 35 to 40,000 troops in death in that war. So after I graduated, I got a diploma from a business school in Philadelphia and then got a job there with IBM. But I was drafted into the Army in February of 1953, went down to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I was inducted, and then had my infantry training at Camp Breckinridge in Kentucky. And it was infantry basic with a little bit of an extension. Finally, I got my orders to ship out, and it was the Far East. So I said to myself, well, that probably means Japan, because after all, my MOS, my military occupational specialty, was 1213, which meant I could take shorthand, which I learned in high school as well as in business school. So we had to be at Fort Lewis, Washington, across the country, and when the day came for us to leave, we went down to the docks and there was a small ship there. I think it took only about 2,000 or so people. And we went across the North Pacific. Took us 2 weeks to sail from Seattle area to Yokohama Bay. And that was the bay where Tokyo was located. We had a little bit of a surprise in that in the hold of the ship were automobiles belonging to U.S. military people who were stationed in Japan. So for about 24 hours, they unloaded these cars one at a time up through the hatch where was my place to stay on the ship. But after about 24 hours or so, we set sail for Sasebo on the southern part of Japan, and that was the preparation to go across to Korea. We had all our clothes and everything taken except our personal kit. They gave us a couple of new uniforms, and very importantly, they gave us a rifle, which we went out to a rifle range, where we went to a rifle range, zeroed in the rifle so that we had to use it. More likely we'd be accurate. And then we had a quick dash across the straits to South Korea, to Busan, From there, we were put on a train and went north to Seoul, where we switched to trucks and we were taken to our individual units. What had happened in the final weeks of my training in Kentucky was that each side decided to pull back a half a mile and create this DMZ, which meant demilitarized zone. So there was a 1 mile wide no man's land, with the idea that after 3 months they would have a peace settlement, or they would go back to fighting, or they would just stay in place, and that's what happened. And that still exists today. A 1 mile no man's land created 60 years ago in June-July time frame of 1953. I was assigned to the 9th Corps headquarters. We were located north of Seoul, about 20 miles or so back from the DMZ. My job there was to take shorthand when we would go out and do inspections or investigations. When we did the investigation, the people were put under oath, and I, of course, would write down everything that was being said. After a year there at 9th Corps, we started to transition our troops out of Korea, and more Korean units were created, just like we're about to do in Afghanistan here in the coming weeks and months. So the 9th Corps went away, and I still had 6 months to go in my enlistment. I was transferred down to 8th Army headquarters, and in the office of the G2, which is intelligence. I expected that probably in the early part of January, I would get notice to get ready to go back home. So I was really surprised. In early December, I was told, you go down to the replacement depot, it's time for you to go. So I did. And the last step there before you got on the ship was records check. They checked my records and they said, you don't belong here. It's too soon for you. You have to go back to your unit. And so I did. And everyone at my unit thought I had changed my mind and re-enlisted, which I hadn't done. And so the powers that be said, you go down to personnel and tell them to get this straightened out. And so they said, we were right, they're wrong down there, you go on back down. Well, till I got down there, the ship had sailed. So they said, well, we're going to, in order to get you discharged in time, we're going to have to put you on orders to fly home. Well, that didn't work out too well because there were a lot of hardship cases that had been brought to the attention of the Red Cross, so they actually had a lot of people waiting for space on a plane to be flown back to the United States. And what happened during the war, and for a short while that I was there, you got 3 points a month if you were up at the front. If you're a little bit further back, you got 2 points, and then way back, 1 point a month. And 36 points, you could go home. So if you were at the front for a year, you rotated home. So that was part of the factor that caused me to be sent down early. So what happened was, after a couple weeks just doing nothing but waiting for your name to come up, my name finally came up on the last day of 1954, and we were flown from Korea to Tokyo, where we got on another plane and came across the Pacific. They didn't have commercial jets then. It was a 4-motor Globemaster. We landed at Wake Island for fuel and then went on to Hawaii, where we switched planes, and after only about 12 hours we were flown out to Traverse Air Force Base, which is located in the San Francisco Bay Area. At that time, there were about 12.5 of us who were to be separated at Fort Meade, Maryland. And they could not get a block of tickets on commercial airlines because it was so close to the holidays. They still had that influence. So they said, well, we'll have to put you on a train. So they did. And we had Pullman car accommodations, upper and lower berth. And the train went from the Bay Area down to Los Angeles and then across the country to Chicago and then Washington, D.C., and eventually to Fort Meade, Maryland. I happened to be the ranking person in the group, so I was given the meal tickets to be used in the dining car. And to my surprise, the manager of the dining car told me that the military people could not eat with everyone else. We had to eat separate. So we probably had to have breakfast around 6:30 in the morning, lunch around 11:30, and then dinner around 4:30. And I was 22, and I had been brought up to obey orders and listen to people in authority, so I went along with it. But in reflection, and this is really the reason I agreed to make these comments, it was an experience that really surprised me, and it was my personal, I guess I could call it discrimination, the fact that 23 months I served in the military, but I couldn't eat in a public dining place. So I hope that you found the highlights of my 23 months of service interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Good job. Good job. And that has affected your interest in Korea, no doubt, throughout your life, hasn't it?
Somewhat.
Somewhat? Uh-huh. Yeah. It's a real place to you, whereas to many of us, it's a point on a map, but you've been there. So
Interesting, my sister, married to a military officer, was stationed there, and she was permitted to join him there, not just for a visit, but to live there.
your sister went to Korea with her
Korea
husband. Okay.
During his term
Interesting.
of assignment.
Oh, okay. All right. So a couple of connections for your family to that country. Yes. Well, Kay Powell is going to come now and give us stories of 3 childhood experiences, and then we have a unique aspect to her presentation today. She has written an original sketch that she's going to do after she tells us her stories. And Herb Moses is going to help with that sketch. Would you come, Kay?
You got this the right way. How did you do
How
it?
is this? Can you hear?
Okay.
Good. I'm going to tell you about three things that happened. These are just about the earliest memories I have. They were all kind of traumatic, and I think that's why I remember them. They all happened before I started school. 2 of them were my own fault, and 1 of them wasn't. One day, my mother was curling her hair with the electric curling iron. We just had one outlet in the ceiling, no wall outlets at all. So she plugged in the curling iron. She was curling away her hair, and I hadn't seen that before. And here was the cord hanging down, and I wondered what would happen if I bit on that cord. And so I found out. I bit down on the cord and just for a minute, and then I tried to open my mouth. And at that point, the electricity hit me full force. And I knew I had to bite back down again. So I did that a couple of times. And by that time, I think my mother kind of caught on that there was something wrong, and she saw what I was doing and quickly unplugged the cord. I don't remember what she did, but I'm sure she reinforced my feeling that I better not do that again. One lesson learned the hard way. The next thing I remembered, we were living in a small town My father was the school superintendent, and my mother was pretty busy with 3 little girls to take care of. By this time, though, the oldest one was in school. Excuse me. So when my mother got caught up with what she had to do, she loved to go around and visit with the ladies in the neighborhood. So one day, she thought, let's go and visit the lady that runs the hardware store. And we knew we went with her. We'd heard the name babysitter, but we didn't know what that meant. Any place Mother went, we went. So we walked the 2 blocks up to the store, and we went in. We knew it would be all right because there just wasn't that much traffic in a hardware store in a little town like that. So the lady brought out a couple of rocking chairs, and she and Mother started talking. Excuse me. My little sister was sitting on my mother's lap, so I didn't have anybody to play with. So I started just wandering around in the store, seeing if I could find something interesting. And I went behind the counter. I'd never been behind the counter before, so everything was interesting. What do you think I found on one of the shelves? A baited mousetrap. And I didn't know what it was, so yes, I picked it up. And the house soon brought help, and I'm sure we didn't stay long after that. The third thing that happened was pretty serious, and it wasn't my fault. We had known for some time that there was a boy that lived next door to us that was he was mean, dangerous, psychotic, because we found out that some years before he had injured a boy across the street very seriously. They had all gone ice skating on the pond, and this boy, our neighbor, picked out the boy across the street, knocked him down, and started jumping up and down on his legs with the ice skates. You can imagine the injury that he caused. That boy had to use crutches from then on. So we didn't know about that. Well, one day he came into our yard, and suddenly the 3 of us were out there playing. Suddenly he grabbed me by the throat. I couldn't do anything to help myself. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. And I thought, what can I do? This must be the end. But I wasn't by myself, so my 2 sisters hollered for my mother. She came out quickly and saved me. After that, I don't really know what happened. I'm sure my parents must have talked to the parents of this boy, but nothing happened. He didn't go away. He was still there. It just went on like before. Nothing happened to him. A couple of years later, his parents had a little baby girl, and when he tried to kill her, they didn't move him. He left, and the neighborhood was safe. I was old enough then to think, how could people, grown-ups, just not care until it came right in the middle of their lives? And that was really a shock to learn. as a result of these three things that happened, I learned three things. The first two were my own curiosity. So I learned to watch that I didn't get myself into much trouble that way. And the third, I had always thought grown-ups were all powerful. They could keep bad things from happening. I found out they don't. It doesn't always work. Okay, that's my stories. Now, I have something else. Do you remember George Burns and Gracie Allen? At the end of their show, George would always ask, "How's your brother Phil, Gracie?" And then she would make a long, long tale of all the things that he had got in trouble over. And when George just couldn't take it anymore, he'd say "Good night, Gracie." And she'd say, "Good night, Gracie. Okay, now I need my helper."
I closed up. Yeah, y'all can tell that, I know.
Okay, George,
You ready?
go ahead.
How's your brother Phil, Gracie?
Well, he has his ups and downs. One day, somebody said, "What you need is exercise. And I've heard that fencing is wonderful exercise. You ought to try it."
Oh, did he do it?
Yes, he thought it was worth a try. So he went out and bought a big load of fencing.
Fencing? Why?
Well, how else could he build a fence? But then he realized he didn't have anything to fence in.
So, what did he do?
Well, he asked the landlord if he could fence in his place.
What did he say?
"Well, if you don't charge me for it." So he went to work, and if I do brag a little bit about Phil, he can build anything. Of course, sometimes his projects come out kind of strange. One time, he built a treehouse on the ground. And when he tried to lift it up into the tree, and you can imagine how hard that was too wide to go through the branches.
What did he do then?
Well, what could he do? He had to saw a branch off the tree, and it hit a guy on the head and knocked him out.
So, what happened?
Well, it turned out he was a lawyer, and he sued Phil.
Oh boy. Well, how did the fence turn out?
Oh, it was lovely.
No problem then?
Well, not till the landlord got home. He admired the fence, and then he said, "Where's the gate?"
Huh, I bet there wasn't one.
"George, you're so smart. You're absolutely right.
What did he say to the landlord?
You never said anything about a gate."
I bet he was mad then.
You bet he was. But Phil is a quick thinker. He said, "I know where I can get a bunch of lumber real quick. Why don't you just mosey down to the bar for a couple of hours, and I'll build you a stile to go over the fence, and you can go in and out as you please."
So, how did the style turn out?
It turned out great. The only problem was the kids in the neighborhood. They loved it. They paraded up and down, in and out of the yard, all day long. And not only that, they laughed and shouted all day until the neighbors complained and reported them.
And then what?
Well, the landlord was accused of having an attractive nuisance and was fined $150.
Boy, oh boy, what did he do to Phil?
Well, at first he chased him around the block, but Phil got his exercise. That was good. And then he kicked him out of his apartment.
But what is he going to do now?
Oh, he'll be fine. I told him he can move in with us.
Say good night, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
Good night, George.
Good night.
Good night, Gracie. Thank you.
I have something to say about
Oh, here, put,
it's back on.
okay, go ahead.
About the that's another thing.
Try it again.
About
Yeah, it's on.
about the Korean War.
Oh,
I had a twin brother who was a Marine aviator. Well, we were both Marine aviators, but I decided I would get out after the end of World War II to go back to college, and he decided he would stay in. And we were down at Paulus Island in the summer of 1950 when the war broke out in Korea. And he got Officer Coast Report right away and went on to the West Coast and got on a carrier and ended up right off the Korean coast. And they were flying in support of ground action in Korea from the carrier. And he was shot down and was the first Marine aviator killed in the Korean War. So that was real sad, and this all of people forget about the wars. And World War II, they didn't even have one word in the paper, I noticed, on D-Day, June the 10th, when they started the invasion of France, and there was not one word in the paper. Now there was, I think, the next day, I think they realized it and had something the next day, but people seem to forget mighty quick.
thank you. Well, thank you.
Could I say something?
Ellen, you want to say something?
I do want to, and it's about both Korea and my father.
Okay,
So maybe
okay.
I might
All
have
right, okay.
A little something.
All right.
Of course, all teachers want to be loved by their students, or at least liked, or at least tolerated. My father was very charismatic, as I said, and they used to follow him out of the university classroom. During the Korean War, there were two pilots who were flying a mission over Korea, and different missions, but they were close enough to talk, and there was a lull, so these two pilots began talking over the airwaves. And one of them said, well, where did you go to Florida? Where did you go to the university? And the other one said, University of Florida. He said, well, for goodness sake, so did I. Did you know Don Pedro? That's my father. And the other one said, yes, wasn't he great? And it gives me a big thrill to think of my father's name in the airways.
Huh? Okay, thank you again for your original sketch that you did. This is a first for us to have something like that. It was very funny. I got to type it out for them to use, and I had a great time. It took me a while to type it because I kept laughing. But it brought back memories of George Burns and Gracie Allen.
You realize that the landlord was still in trouble. He still had that style.
That's right, the landlord was still in trouble. That's right. But Phil was going to come live with you, so everything was okay, right? Yeah. Yeah. No, okay. Well, you see what happens, what's happened here. What Harold told sparked something that Herb remembered and wanted to give testimony to today about your brother. And that also sparked something for Ellen to tell more. And that's what happens. You hear other people's stories. And I know this stirs up stories in you. And some of you have stood up here and shared those. And some of you have not done that yet. And we want to hear from you.
And don't make us come after you.
Well, that's true. That's true. You don't want that to happen, do you? We have Bill Hammis will be sharing a story with us in July, and we have openings for at least 3 other storytellers. So keep that in mind, won't you? Thank you for being here
And
today.
here's the movie list for tomorrow if anybody wants to grab one of those.
Thank you. Thank you all.